January 17, 1943. Over the South Pacific, the sky hung heavy with steel-grey clouds, and beneath them the ocean stretched endlessly, a rippling expanse of indigo and foam that held no mercy for the falling. Inside the crippled cockpit of a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, Captain James Ward felt the controls shudder violently in his hands. The starboard engine had been silent for 11 minutes. The port engine coughed black smoke into the humid air, its cylinders misfiring in irregular bursts that sent tremors through the aluminum fuselage. Behind him 40 men sat strapped into canvas seats, infantrymen from the 43rd Division, their faces pale beneath tropical tans, their knuckles white against the webbing. They had survived Guadalcanal, they had endured the fetid heat of the jungle, the screaming descent of Japanese artillery, the malarial fevers that turned strong men into shivering wraiths, and now they sat in a dying aircraft, 6,000 feet above water that would swallow them whole if Ward made a single miscalculation. The fuel gauge needle kissed empty. The mathematics were merciless. At current altitude and airspeed, with one engine dead and the other drinking its last reserves, he had perhaps 4 minutes of flight remaining. Maybe 5 if God was generous. The nearest airstrip, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, lay 83 nautical miles to the southwest, an impossible distance. Standard operating procedure was clear: ditch in the ocean, deploy life rafts, pray the Navy spotted the wreckage before sharks or exposure finished the work. The war had started. Ward's co-pilot, Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, had already begun broadcasting their position on the emergency frequency, his voice tight with the controlled panic of a man who understood exactly what ditching meant. Survival rates for water landings in the Pacific Theater hovered near 30%. 40 men would become 12, perhaps 15 if fortune smiled. But Ward was not thinking about fortune. He was thinking about fuel, or rather the absence of it, and the peculiar physics of impossibility. In the winter of 1942, the United States military had begun a campaign of logistical supremacy that would ultimately decide the war's outcome long before the first Allied boot touched Normandy's beaches. While Japanese forces stretched their supply lines across thousands of miles of conquered territory, subsisting on dwindling rice rations and ammunition reserves that grew thinner with each passing month, American industry had transformed itself into the arsenal of democracy, with a speed that defied historical precedent. Every 72 hours, American factories produced another Liberty ship. Every day, assembly lines in Detroit, Seattle, and Long Beach delivered aircraft at a rate that left Axis planners incredulous. By January 1943, the United States was manufacturing one new airplane every 5 minutes, yet this abundance created its own complication. Pilots like Ward, trained in the efficient but unforgiving doctrine of standardized procedure, were taught to treat fuel as both lifeline and constraint. You calculated range, added a safety margin, and never ever pushed beyond the red line on the gauge. To do otherwise was to court death, not the glorious death of combat, but the stupid, wasteful death of miscalculation. Ward had seen the wreckage of pilots who gambled with fuel, twisted aluminum scattered across jungle canopies, oil slicks spreading across the Pacific like accusation. The mathematics of aviation were written in the graves of optimists. But Ward had also seen something else during his months flying supply runs across the Solomon Islands. He had seen pilots abort missions with half-full tanks because regulations demanded it. He had seen good men die waiting for rescue because their aircraft commanders followed the manual instead of their instinct. And he had begun to suspect that the very abundance that gave America its advantage had also bred a kind of timidity, a reflexive adherence to procedure, that sometimes valued protocol over lives. They did not know that other pilots in the 43rd Troop Carrier Group called him Calculator Ward, half in admiration and half in mockery, because he had a disturbing habit of flying routes that other commanders declared impossible. 3 weeks earlier, he had landed a fully loaded C-47 on a jungle airstrip that the engineers swore was too short, too soft, too dangerous. He had made his approach at an angle that violated every principle in the Army Air Force's flight manual, dropping the aircraft onto the muddy strip with such precision that his wheels touched down within 10 feet of the threshold. The engineers had watched in silence as he taxied to a stop, then unloaded 4,000 pounds of medical supplies that saved a field hospital from collapse. Later, over watery coffee in the operations tent, the lead engineer had asked him how he calculated the approach. Ward had smiled and said he had not calculated anything, he had simply looked at the strip and known it would hold. It was not magic, though it seemed like it to men who lived by slide rules and reference tables. Ward possessed a rare form of spatial intelligence, an almost preternatural ability to judge distances, angles and velocities without conscious thought. He could glance at a patch of ground and estimate its load-bearing capacity. He could feel a crosswind's strength by watching palm fronds sway. His mind processed aerodynamic variables with the speed and accuracy of a mechanical computer, translating sensory data into instant understanding. Other pilots studied their instruments. Ward studied the world. But this gift came with a burden. He saw possibilities that others dismissed as fantasy, and when he acted on those possibilities, he often found himself alone, praised when he succeeded, but isolated by the unbridgeable gap between his perception and everyone else's caution. Now at 6,000 feet with fuel exhausted and 40 lives depending on his choices, Ward made a decision that would have earned him a court-martial if it failed. He pushed the yoke forward, dropping the nose into a shallow dive and shut down the dying port engine. The propeller windmilled once, twice, then froze into stillness. The sudden silence was profound. No engine roar, no mechanical thunder, only the whistle of wind across aluminum skin and the thrum of air through the empty fuel tanks. Brennan turned to stare at him, eyes wide with disbelief. "We're gliding," Ward said quietly, as if announcing the weather. "Calculate our descent rate at 90 knots. Give me a heading for Henderson." Brennan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Sir, we have no power. We're 80 miles from 79.2, Ward corrected, his gaze fixed on the horizon, "and we have 6,000 feet of altitude. At a glide ratio of 10 to 1, we can cover 10 nautical miles for every 1,000 feet we drop. Basic physics, Lieutenant. We have the altitude. We just need to spend it wisely." It was the most absurd proposition Brennan had ever heard. A C-47's published glide ratio was closer to 8 to 1 under ideal conditions, and these conditions were far from ideal. They were heavy with fuel weight, even though the tanks read empty. Residual fuel and the men and equipment aboard added thousands of pounds. Wind shear and turbulence would bleed altitude faster than any calculation predicted. And even if Ward's mathematics were sound, he was proposing to glide a multi-ton aircraft across 80 miles of ocean without power, navigating by dead reckoning, and somehow arrive at Henderson Field with enough altitude to execute a landing pattern. It was not merely dangerous, it was impossible. Except Ward had already trimmed the aircraft for optimal glide speed. He had already factored in the weight distribution, the wind direction, the air density at their altitude. His hands moved across the controls with casual precision, adjusting the elevator trim, banking gently to catch a thermal rising from the sun-warmed ocean below. He was not hoping to reach Henderson Field. He knew he would reach it. The mathematics had already spoken, and the mathematics did not lie. Behind them, the 40 infantrymen felt the engines die and understood they were falling. Some closed their eyes, some prayed. A few simply sat in the numb acceptance of men who had already used up their allotment of luck on Guadalcanal and were now waiting for the bill to come due. None of them knew that Ward was attempting something no transport pilot had ever successfully executed. A dead-stick glide across open ocean in a fully loaded cargo aircraft. They only knew the terrible silence, the slow tilting of the deck beneath their boots, and the steady whistle of wind that sounded like a dirge. Minutes passed. The altimeter unwound with glacial steadiness. 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. Ward rode invisible rivers of air, banking to catch updrafts, leveling to conserve altitude through dead zones. Brennan called out their position every 5 minutes, his voice growing quieter as he realized they were actually maintaining course. The island of Guadalcanal emerged from the haze ahead, a green smudge against the blue, growing larger with agonizing slowness. 2,000 feet, 1,500. Henderson Field materialized on the island's northern coast, its twin runways scratched into the coral like scars. At 800 feet, Ward had a choice: attempt a standard landing pattern, or come straight in, trading any remaining altitude for a direct approach. A standard pattern would be safer, more controlled, but it would also consume precious altitude in the turning maneuver. A straight-in approach would commit them irrevocably. If he misjudged the glide slope, they would undershoot and crash into the jungle a mile short of the runway. There would be no second chance, no opportunity to correct. Every pilot in the Pacific Theater would have chosen the pattern. Ward chose the straight line. He trimmed for final approach speed, watching the runway grow in the windscreen. 500 feet, 400. The jungle canopy passed beneath them, individual trees now visible, close enough to see the tangled vines and the bomb craters filled with stagnant water. Ground personnel at Henderson looked up at the silent aircraft descending toward them like a ghost, its propellers frozen, no engine noise, only the eerie rush of wind. Someone later said it looked like a bird shot from the sky, gliding toward Earth on dead wing. At 100 feet, Ward deployed full flaps, The C-47 shuddered, trading speed for lift, the nose rising slightly as air resistance bit into the metal surfaces. The runway threshold passed beneath them, right where Ward had calculated it would. The wheels kissed coral with barely a bump, and the aircraft rolled straight and true down the center line, slowing gradually until it stopped 3/4 of the way down the strip. Ward engaged the parking brake and sat back in his seat. His hands were steady. He had not sweated. Brennan stared at him, then at the runway, then back at Ward. That's not possible," he whispered. "We had no fuel, we had no power. You just flew the aircraft," Ward finished. "That's all, just flew it." Within an hour, every pilot on Henderson Field knew the story. Within a day it had spread through the 4th Group, and across the entire transport command in the Pacific Theater. Most pilots refused to believe it. Fuel exhaustion over open ocean meant ditching. That was doctrine, that was reality, that was the hard truth written in the logbooks of every dead aviator who had tried otherwise. They examined Ward's flight logs, searching for evidence that he had miscalculated his fuel state, that he had actually possessed some hidden reserve. They found nothing. He had glided a 10-ton aircraft across 80 nautical miles of ocean without power and landed safely. The mathematics confirmed it, the witnesses confirmed it, and yet it remained, in the minds of practical men, impossible. Some called him lucky, others called him reckless, a cowboy whose gamble had paid off but could just as easily have killed everyone aboard. A few senior officers quietly suggested that Ward's refusal to follow ditching protocol should result in disciplinary action, regardless of the outcome. But the 40 men he had saved told a different story. They spoke of the silence in the cabin, the terrible descent, and the moment when wheels touched coral and they realized they would live. They spoke of Ward's calmness, his absolute certainty, and the way he had transformed death into deliverance, through nothing more than skill and mathematics, and a refusal to accept the word impossible. In Tokyo, in the winter of 1943, Japanese military planners pored over reports of American logistics with growing desperation. The numbers were incomprehensible: thousands of aircraft, millions of tons of supplies, ships arriving daily at ports across the Pacific. Japanese pilots flew missions with fuel tanks barely adequate to reach their targets, let alone return home. They rationed ammunition, counting bullets like misers counting coins, and yet they kept encountering American pilots who seemed to operate with limitless resources, who could afford to waste fuel on training flights, who discarded damaged equipment rather than repairing it. It was an abundance that felt almost obscene, a wealth that defied the Japanese understanding of warfare as a contest of endurance and sacrifice. But what they did not understand, what Ward's glide proved in a way that no amount of industrial statistics could, was that American abundance had bred a paradoxical scarcity of imagination. With so much material at their disposal, American commanders had grown comfortable with waste, with following procedures that prioritized equipment over initiative. They calculated by the book because they could afford to. They played it safe because resources were expendable, and in doing so they sometimes forgot that the true resource was not fuel or ammunition or aircraft, but the human capacity for improvisation, for seeing solutions where regulations saw only limits. Ward had no more fuel than a Japanese pilot scraping by on fuel. He had no magical technology, no secret advantage. What he possessed was a different kind of abundance, the freedom to think beyond doctrine, to trust his own perception over printed instructions, to believe that mathematics and skill could overcome material constraint. It was the abundance of autonomy, of individual judgment, of the peculiarly American conviction that rules existed to be challenged by those competent enough to do so safely. The symbolic weight of fuel or its absence echoed through every corner of the Pacific War. For Japanese aviators, fuel was destiny. They flew long-range missions to targets at the very edge of their aircraft's capabilities, knowing that even minor combat damage or headwinds would leave them swimming in the Pacific. Fuel governed strategy, dictated tactics, limited ambition. Japanese pilots became experts at gliding, at stretching every drop, at nursing damaged engines across hundreds of miles of ocean. It was a skill born of necessity, refined through desperation. American pilots, by contrast, flew with the confidence of men who knew that fuel trucks would be waiting when they landed, that tankers would arrive weekly with thousands of gallons, that the supply chain stretched unbroken back to Texas refineries and California ports. They could afford to be profligate. They could afford to abandon aircraft with half-full tanks if mechanical issues arose. They could afford to follow regulations that built in massive safety margins. Ward existed in the space between these two philosophies. He understood scarcity. He had flown enough missions to see the ragged edge where supply lines frayed, but he refused to let abundance breed complacency. When his fuel ran dry, he did not panic or despair. He simply shifted from one mode of flight to another, from powered to unpowered, and continued flying. The fuel's absence became irrelevant. What mattered was altitude, airspeed, and the unchanging laws of aerodynamics. In this way, Ward's impossible glide became a microcosm of American victory, not because of overwhelming material superiority alone, but because that material base enabled individuals to take risks, to innovate, to act on convictions that more constrained societies could not afford to entertain. Japanese pilots glided out of desperation, Ward glided out of choice, and that difference, multiplied across 10,000 engagements, 10,000 moments where American servicemen chose initiative over procedure, defined the war's ultimate outcome. After the war, Ward returned to civilian life, and rarely spoke of his service. When asked about the glide, he would shrug and say he had simply done what needed doing. He never claimed to be heroic. He never framed his decision as anything more than applied mathematics. But those who flew with him understood something that could not be quantified in flight manuals or after-action reports. Ward had looked at 40 doomed men, and refused to accept their doom. He had taken the equation everyone else said equaled death, and solved it differently, not through hope or prayer or luck, but through absolute mastery of his craft, and an unshakable belief that skill could overcome circumstance. In the decades that followed, aviation instructors occasionally taught the story of Ward's glide as a lesson in dead-stick procedure. They analyzed his descent rate, his glide ratio, his approach angle. They turned his improvisation into doctrine, his intuition into something that could be studied and replicated. But in doing so, they missed the essential truth. Ward had not followed any procedure. He had simply looked at the sky, the ocean, the aircraft, and the runway, and seen a path that existed nowhere except in his understanding of how physics and possibility intersected. The 40 men he saved went on to live ordinary lives: farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, fathers. Most never knew the full extent of what Ward had done, how close they had come to dying, how many pilots would have ditched rather than attempt the impossible. They only knew that they had boarded a dying aircraft over the Pacific, and walked off alive on Guadalcanal. That was enough. That was everything. There is a moment in every war when the mythology of invincibility cracks, when the side that believes itself destined for victory confronts evidence that the universe does not bend to willpower alone. For Japan, that moment came in 1,000 small defeats, fuel shortages, supply failures, logistical collapses. For individual Japanese soldiers and pilots, it came in encounters with Americans who seemed to operate under different rules, who possessed not just more equipment but more freedom, more license to improvise, more trust in individual judgment. Ward's glide was one such moment, though no Japanese commander ever learned of it. It existed in the private mythology of American aircrews, a story told over drinks, and in barracks, passed from squadron to squadron like a talisman. It said, "Our pilots can fly without fuel." It said, "Our men find ways when there are no ways." It said, "We do not accept the limits that others accept." And in saying these things, it spoke a deeper truth about the conflict between systems, one rigid and hierarchical, demanding obedience even unto death, the other chaotic and individualistic, trusting competence over rank. Neither system was inherently superior, but in war, in that crucible where doctrine met reality and only adaptation survived, the system that allowed a pilot to shut down his engines and glide 80 miles on mathematics and skill, that system held an advantage no industrial output could quantify. A C-47 fell through tropical sky toward an impossible landing. 40 men held their breath, and one pilot, whom others called reckless and lucky and impossible, simply flew. The fuel gauge read empty, but the air itself became fuel, invisible, inexhaustible, obedient to those who understood its laws. When the wheels touched coral and the impossible became accomplished fact, Ward proved something that no propaganda film could ever capture, that abundance is not measured in gallons of fuel or tons of steel, but in the freedom to believe that limits exist only until someone competent enough refuses to accept them. The war would grind on for 2 more years. Thousands more would die. Victory would require millions of tons of material, millions of men, the combined industrial might of a continent. But it would also require moments like this, singular, unrepeatable instances when one person looked at mathematics and intuition and chose to fly when everyone else said fall. That choice, more than any resource stockpile, more than any factory's output, was the abundance that authoritarianism could never replicate. It was the fuel that never ran empty,
the human capacity to imagine beyond constraint, to calculate beyond doctrine, and to land safely on the far side of impossible.